A former Auschwitz guard has been sentenced to 5 years in jail after being convicted over his role at the Nazi death camp. Reinhold Hanning, now 94, was found guilty of being an accessory to the murder of at least 170,000 people.
At the end of World War II, the Allies meticulously documented the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. Photographs of the extermination camps, survivor testimonies, and thousands of official documents became part of the judicial archives. Shortly afterward, the Nuremberg Trials set a precedent. For the first time, high-ranking officials were tried for crimes against humanity. However, beyond these visible figures, many direct collaborators remained outside the judicial spotlight. For decades, mid-level and administrative officials remained untouched. Only in recent years has a renewed commitment from the German justice system begun to bring them to trial. One such case was that of Oskar Gröning, known as the bookkeeper of Auschwitz. Although he held administrative positions, he was found guilty of complicity in the deaths of more than 300,000 people. His trial, held in 2015, marked a historic shift in judicial standards. This documentary examines how these men live today, what decisions allowed their impunity, and why, only now, have some finally begun to be held accountable before the law. Karl Münter, the SS soldier who never showed remorse. One of the most revealing examples is that of Karl Münter. Born in 1922, he was just 21 years old when, as a non-commissioned officer in the Waffen-SS, he participated in one of the most brutal reprisals committed by German troops on French soil, the Ascq massacre. It all began on the night of April 1st, 1944. His unit was travelling from Belgium to France when an attack by the French resistance derailed 3 carriages of a train carrying some 400 SS members. In retaliation, a massive raid was launched in the village of Ascq. Münter, along with other soldiers, led house searches. In one of the houses searched lived a young boy, Roland Bond, who witnessed his father being arrested after they burst into his room. Throughout that night, 86 men were executed. Their bodies were found lying in streets, houses, and train stations. The order was clear: eliminate those supposedly responsible for the sabotage. What followed was even more revealing. In 1949, a French military tribunal opened a formal investigation. 9 SS members were prosecuted. Some appeared in court. Others, like Münter, were tried in absentia. By then, he had already returned to Nordstemmen, his hometown in Lower Saxony. The French court sentenced him to death, but the sentence was never carried out. German authorities refused to extradite him. Despite this sentence, Karl Münter lived openly under his real identity. He settled down as a postal worker, started a family, and was active in his town's cultural club, where he was known for his interest in the local dialect. His past as a convicted war criminal did not prevent him from receiving public recognition for his cultural contributions. This same pattern of impunity persisted for decades. It wasn't until 2016 that German prosecutors managed to reopen the case. After identifying his address, they searched his home. Münter's reaction was one of disbelief. He couldn't understand why the matter was being reopened after so much time. But the legal response was conclusive. Having been convicted in France, he could not be tried again for the same acts, and although the murder did not have a statute of limitations under German law, the statute of limitations in the French case was binding. By then, his public image had already begun to deteriorate. In 2008, during a television interview, Münter expressed opinions that downplayed the Holocaust and the number of victims. The reaction was immediate. The cultural club that had honored him withdrew its recognition and expelled him. More than his words, it was his tone that generated outrage. No signs of remorse or compassion. The controversy forced local authorities to act. For the first time, the city council publicly debated how the community should position itself regarding its past. An institutional motion was unanimously approved, condemning Münter's statements and expressing solidarity with the victims. Although some feared that bringing the case to light could strengthen extremist groups, others warned that silence also carries risks. 10 years later, in 2018, Münter reappeared in a new interview. This time, he spoke directly about his participation in the Ascq massacre. He justified the shootings by claiming that the detainees tried to escape and stated that his role had been to separate the men, a responsibility he, in his words, assumed without reservation. Despite his claims, both judicial investigations and historical documents confirmed that the victims were unarmed civilians. Again, there was no sign of remorse. The community of Ascq, however, never stopped remembering. Every 5 years, a memorial ceremony is held in which 86 children carry torches, one for each victim. Faces and names are projected onto the memorial. Among them is the name of the father of a woman who still lives in the same house that was searched that night. The suffering, for its part, was not limited to the social sphere. In many families, the loss remains. Clovis Cook, one of those murdered, was 31 years old. His daughter, Marie Margarita Barr, also lost her brother. For her, the commemoration is not a choice. It is an intimate, unavoidable necessity. Returning to that place, repeating the ritual, allows her to pay tribute to those who were awakened and executed without warning. Following the controversy sparked by Karl's public statements, some residents of Nordstemmen reacted with unease, though not all shared his outrage. In interviews conducted in the following years, several residents expressed a desire to put the matter behind them. Some defended the former SS member, arguing that his thoughts were a private matter and that, given his age, they should not be exposed again. Others acknowledged the gravity of his actions but considered it unnecessary to dwell on them after so many decades. These kinds of responses generated unease beyond the local area. Historian Jens Christian Wagner, responsible for several memorial sites in Lower Saxony, warned of a worrying trend. Although most Germans claim to support remembering the victims of Nazism, the discourse shifts when it comes to identifying those responsible. Defensive attitudes persist, fueled by the passage of time and the discomfort of acknowledging family ties to the criminal past. A recent study showed that 1 in 3 Germans would like to close the chapter on historical revision. Only 1/5 accept that there may have been war criminals among their own ancestors. Faced with this lack of awareness, Wagner spearheaded an exhibition focused exclusively on the perpetrators of the crimes, especially the role of Wehrmacht soldiers, long portrayed as honorable figures. In his view, without understanding who the perpetrators were and how the society that supported them functioned, it is impossible to comprehend why there were so many victims. In Nordstemmen, the case of Karl Münter also reached the classroom. Students from Marienberg High School analyzed his life story and became interested in traveling to Auschwitz. The topic ceased to be abstract. Upon seeing excerpts from the interview in which the elderly man downplayed the Holocaust, many students were shocked by his tone. Some expressed that while they didn't know how to judge his personal story, they didn't think it appropriate for him to be publicly treated as a respected figure. During their trip, they had their first encounter with a direct witness. Christina Diehl, an 81-year-old Roma woman, recounted how the SS murdered 42 members of her family in a Polish village in 1943. She explained how young children were not killed with weapons, but rather slammed against walls. Thanks to her grandmother's help, she managed to escape and take refuge in a farmer's house, passing herself off as Polish. 75 years after the events in Ascq, the commemoration continues. A new torchlight march brought together more than 1,000 people, including descendants of the victims. German journalist Erich Abidal, author of a report on Karl, also attended and met Alexandre de Leysen, the great-grandson of one of the executed men. No official representative of Nordstemmen was present. Meanwhile, the central office in Ludwigsburg continues its investigation into the crimes of the Nazi regime. Of the approximately 170,000 suspects identified since the end of the war, less than 10% faced formal charges, and only a fraction were ultimately convicted. For Jens Rommel, one of the heads of the institution, this low proportion reflects not only legal difficulties, but also a lack of political will in the post-war period. Many former Nazi officials remained in their posts after 1945, directly influencing the legal proceedings. While it is not always possible to prove deliberate obstruction, it can be said that the commitment to justice was limited. During the 1950s, most of German society preferred to avoid confronting its own past. Economic reconstruction and the trauma of the war outweighed the need for accountability. Even denazification was questioned as divisive. This mentality also affected the judicial system. In the Auschwitz trials, the courts demanded concrete proof of direct involvement in each murder, allowing numerous collaborators to avoid conviction. This lack of justice continues to have consequences. Paul P., a former member of the Waffen-SS, frequently attends events organized by extremist groups. At these events, he downplays the crimes of the regime, praising his unit as if it were merely a military force. He acknowledges that neo-Nazis celebrate these events, and it doesn't bother him. Even minors brought by their families attend his lectures. His distorted narrative transforms the perpetrators into role models for new generations. Despite the public magnitude of the case and the enduring memory surrounding it, Karl Münter never appeared before a German court. In March 2018, the Public Prosecutor's Office definitively closed the investigation, eliminating any possibility of a trial. The decision was based on a strictly legal criterion. He had been convicted in absentia by the French military courts in 1949 for his direct involvement in the Ascq massacre. That death sentence, never carried out due to Germany's refusal to extradite him, precluded any further prosecution, based on the legal principle that prohibits double jeopardy. From then on, he remained in Nordstemmen, using his real name and making no attempt to hide. He lived surrounded by neighbors who in many cases knew who he was and what he had done. The lack of judicial cooperation between countries, coupled with the statute of limitations having expired in France, ensured that the sentence would never be carried out. In 2019, Karl Münter died at the age of 96 in the same town where he had spent most of his life after the war. He died without facing any new criminal charges in Germany, nor showing any sign of remorse. His death closed a chapter that justice failed to resolve, leaving open the wounds of those who, like the residents of Ascq, never forgot. The secret that betrayed Oskar Gröning. Unlike Münter, Oskar Gröning did face justice. His story marked a turning point in the German legal approach to collaborators of the Nazi regime. Born in 1921 in Nuremberg, then part of Prussia, he grew up in an environment marked by discipline, resentment, and obedience. His mother died when he was just 4 years old. His father, a war veteran and member of Der Stahlhelm, the Steel Helmet, harbored a deep resentment for the treatment that, in his view, Germany had received after the Treaty of Versailles. The bankruptcy of his small textile business in 1929 only intensified this disillusionment. From an early age, Oskar showed a strong attraction to military symbols. Even as a child, he remembered with admiration photographs of his grandfather in uniform, mounted on a horse and holding a trumpet. This fascination, combined with the dominant ideology in his family environment, led him first to the Stahlhelm Youth Wing, and then, with the rise of the National Socialist Party to power, to join the Hitler Youth. His identification with the regime was early and profound. He participated in acts such as the public burning of banned books, convinced that he was contributing to national rebirth. Later, he abandoned his studies to begin banking training, but after the outbreak of war in 1939, he decided to voluntarily join the SS. He did so without informing his father, who disapproved of his decision. Gröning was accepted in 1940 and assigned to administrative duties related to payroll within the organization. At the beginning of 1942, Oskar Gröning's career within the SS took a decisive turn. Until then, he had performed accounting duties, but a new internal directive stipulated that these administrative positions be filled exclusively by wounded veterans. As a result, Gröning and his colleagues were summoned to Berlin, where they reported to an economic office of the Corps. There, a group of high-ranking officers reminded them of the oath of loyalty they had sworn upon entering. They were then given a special task that required absolute discretion. Before learning their destination, they had to sign a declaration promising not to reveal this information, not even to family members. They were then divided into small groups, taken to different train stations, and put on a ship to Katowice with precise instructions. Report to the commandant of Auschwitz. Upon arrival, they were temporarily housed in barracks designated for SS personnel. Gröning immediately noticed that living conditions there were significantly better than at other destinations, with a food supply that exceeded the usual standard. The welcome was cordial, but also marked by bewilderment. No one explained the purpose of the camp in detail. They were only told that it was a unique facility, and that they would understand its function in time. The next day they went to the administration building. During an interview, an officer valued Gröning's banking experience and assigned him to a section in charge of handling prisoners' money. There, he was told that the confiscated funds were supposedly being held for later return. That version, however, quickly fell apart. When he asked questions, his colleagues made it clear that those deportees would not leave alive. Among them was the group transported the night before. It was then that Gröning realized that Auschwitz did not operate like a conventional internment camp. After his time at Auschwitz, Oskar requested to be assigned to a combat front. The request was granted in 1944, and shortly afterward, he was assigned to an SS unit participating in the Ardennes offensive. During the fighting, he was wounded and taken to a field hospital. Once recovered, he rejoined his unit, which would eventually surrender to British forces. In that context, Gröning quickly understood that mentioning any connection to the concentration camp system could be detrimental. Therefore, when interrogated by the British, he concealed his time at Auschwitz and claimed to have worked for an SS administrative section. He justified this decision by stating, in his words, that the victor is always right, and acknowledging that events had occurred there that violated fundamental human rights. Along with other members of his unit, he was confined in a former concentration camp and, in 1946, transferred to the United Kingdom as a forced labourer. There, he described living in relative comfort. He had good food, received a salary, and participated in musical performances during a tour of Scotland and the Midlands, where he performed German religious songs and traditional English pieces for receptive audiences. Upon his return to Germany in 1947, Gröning resumed civilian life. He could not return to banking, as his membership in the SS disqualified him from such employment. Instead, he found work in a glass factory, where he rose through the ranks to a management position in human resources. Later, he even served as an honorary judge in labor courts. During this period, he avoided any mention of his past. When, at a family dinner, a connection to the regime's crimes was suggested, his reaction was unequivocal. He demanded that the subject not be discussed again, or he would leave home. Over time, this silence was finally broken. At a meeting of his philatelic club, a participant expressed his opposition to the criminalization of Holocaust denial. The conversation led Gröning to review a Holocaust denier pamphlet, to which he responded in writing, claiming to have witnessed the gas chambers, crematoria, and selection processes at Auschwitz. These words circulated without his consent in media outlets linked to the far right, triggering a wave of messages from people denying his testimony. Faced with this pressure, he decided to speak publicly. He declared that what he had witnessed was not an illusion but real events, and asked that his account be believed because, he said, he was there. The repercussions of these statements did not stop there. Years later, what had begun as a personal response in an informal conversation ended up acquiring unexpected legal weight. In September 2014, when Gröning was 93 years old, the German Public Prosecutor's Office filed charges against him for his role as an accomplice in the murder of hundreds of thousands of people at Auschwitz. According to the prosecution, during the summer of 1944, he assisted in receiving and sorting the personal belongings of deportees, thus facilitating the logistical operation of the extermination. Specifically, he was accused of contributing to the murder of 300,000 Hungarian Jews, deported in 137 convoys during a systematic operation of annihilation. The case was made possible by a recent legal precedent: the conviction of former Sobibor guard John Demjanjuk, not for individual acts of violence, but for his mere functional presence in an extermination camp. Based on this precedent, the German authorities launched a final legal offensive against the remaining collaborators of the Nazi regime. The trial of Oskar Gröning began on April 20, 2015, in the Nuremberg Regional Court. In his opening statement, he acknowledged his moral responsibility for having been part of the Auschwitz system. He asserted that there was no doubt about his ethical guilt and asked for forgiveness, although he left the assessment of his criminal responsibility to the court. During the sessions, several survivors testified as civil parties. Among them was Eva Moses Kor, who, along with her twin sister, had been subjected to medical experiments at the camp. After testifying, she approached the defendant and hugged him, generating mixed reactions among other attendees. Max Eisen, then a teenager, recounted the methods used in the extermination zone, including the collection of teeth from corpses. Susan Pollock, deported from Hungary, described the overcrowded and physically deteriorating conditions in the barracks, where she shared space with hundreds of other young people. As the trial continued in Nuremberg, new testimonies broadened the emotional and documentary scope of the proceedings. That same day, Ivor Pearl, an 83-year-old British citizen born in Hungary, into an observant Jewish family, testified that he was 12 years old when he was deported to Auschwitz. She recounted how both her parents and 7 of her siblings died during the Holocaust. Shortly afterward, Irene Weiss, an 84-year-old witness from the United States, recalled her family's arrival at the camp in May 1944. During the wave of mass deportations of Hungarian Jews, she lost her parents, 4 of her siblings, and 13 cousins. On July 15, 2015, the court found Oskar Gröning guilty of being an accessory to the murder of at least 300,000 people. Eva Moses-Kor, who had testified weeks earlier, expressed her disappointment with the sentence. She questioned the symbolic value of a 4-year prison term and asked for an explanation of how such a sentence could represent justice for the victims. The defense, led by lawyer Hans Holtermann, reviewed the ruling with the intention of filing an appeal. The judicial response was swift. On November 28, 2016, the German Federal Court of Justice dismissed the appeal. In August 2017, the authorities concluded that Oskar was fit to serve his sentence, despite his advanced age. A subsequent request to the Constitutional Court was also rejected. This body ruled that age alone did not justify suspending his prison sentence. On January 15, 2018, Oskar Gröning applied for a pardon, but his request was denied. Just a few weeks later, on March 9th, he died in a hospital in Lower Saxony. He was 96 years old and died before beginning to serve his sentence. Reinhold Hanning, the silent guardian of Auschwitz. Following the Gröning case, German justice continued to focus its attention on other former SS members. One of them was Reinhold Hanning, born in late 1921 in the Lippe region of northern Germany. His childhood was uneventful. He first attended elementary school and, upon finishing his studies, began working in a factory. At the age of 14, he joined the Hitler Youth, a common practice in Germany at the time. 4 years later, influenced by his family, he decided to voluntarily join the Waffen-SS. His enlistment coincided with the expansion of the European conflict. During World War II, he was assigned to the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, a unit that operated on several fronts. In 1941, while fighting near Kiev, he was wounded by shrapnel. The head and leg injuries rendered him unfit for further combat. It was then, in early 1942, that he was assigned to the concentration camp system, becoming part of the staff at Auschwitz. Auschwitz, established in 1940, was the largest extermination center of the Nazi regime. Its total area exceeded 40 square kilometers, and approximately 1.1 million people died there. The majority of the victims were Jewish, although Roma, people with disabilities, homosexuals, political prisoners, non-Jewish Polish citizens and captured Soviet soldiers were also murdered. In this context, between 1942 and 1944, Hanning served as an SS guard at the complex. He was directly involved in receiving trains loaded with deportees, especially in the arrival area, and participated in their transfer to the extermination facilities. During his service, he witnessed the mass arrival of Hungarian Jews, many of whom were murdered shortly after their arrival. His time at the camp earned him a promotion. In September 1943, he was promoted to the rank of Unterscharführer. After spending 2 years at Auschwitz, in June 1944, he was transferred to Sachsenhausen, a camp located further north. At the end of the war, he was captured by Allied troops and remained in custody until mid-1948. Once liberated, he led a life away from the public eye, first as a cook for the British, then as a transporter and merchant, until he finally retired as a businessman in the 1980s. However, the German judicial system reopened his case many years later. In 2016, he was brought before the Detmold court, accused of having contributed to the systematic murder of more than 170,000 people during his time at Auschwitz. The trial, which attracted international attention, took place with Hanning in a wheelchair, visibly frail. During the initial sessions, he kept a low profile and avoided making statements. It wasn't until April that, of his own volition, he read a brief statement before the court. In his statement, he expressed remorse for having been part of a structure responsible for the deaths of thousands of innocent people. He stated that he felt ashamed for not having acted in the face of what he described as a known injustice. Although he did not admit to having used direct violence, he acknowledged his passive complicity. His defense strategy focused on minimizing his involvement, arguing that he never committed violent acts nor had direct contact with the executions. However, the prosecutors argued that his work as a guard included escorting groups of newly arrived prisoners to the facilities where the killings took place. Throughout the trial, more than a dozen Auschwitz survivors testified, stating that they had seen scenes of piled-up bodies, constant smoke, and the persistent smell of burnt flesh. Judge Anke Gruder strongly rejected the arguments presented by the defense. She emphasized that Hanning was not merely a passive cog in the machine, but an efficient and willing collaborator. According to his testimony, no one could have remained at that camp for more than 2 years, including promotions, without knowing the full extent of what was happening there. He added that had he wished, he could have requested to return to the front. The reading of Reinhold Hanning's sentence not only marked the end of his individual trial, but also reflected a profound shift in the legal approach adopted in Germany in recent years. Unlike previous decades, when specific evidence of direct participation in murder was required, the new jurisprudence established that mere active membership in the Auschwitz structure was sufficient to impute criminal responsibility. Under this interpretation, any SS member assigned to the camp was considered an operational part of the extermination system. The defense, however, took a contrary position. Johannes Salman, Hanning's lawyer, requested his acquittal, arguing that his client had never murdered or physically assaulted anyone. He argued that upon joining the SS, the accused acted out of obedience within an organization whose true nature he did not understand at the time. According to his argument, Hanning was a young man without higher education, lacking critical thinking skills, and therefore incapable of foreseeing the implications of his actions. The accused made no further personal statements before the verdict was announced. Only in a previous hearing did he publicly express his remorse again. He acknowledged once more having belonged to an organization responsible for the deaths of thousands of innocent people and the suffering of countless families. The reaction of the World Jewish Congress was immediate. Its president, Ronald S. Lauder, welcomed the court's decision, describing it as a belated but just ruling. He emphasized that Hanning had been a functional part of a system of extermination whose existence would have been impossible without the collaboration of individuals like him. Among those attending the trial were other survivors, such as William Gleed, a resident of Canada, and Joshua Kaufman, who attended with his daughters. For them, the trial represented an act of symbolic justice, regardless of the length of the sentence imposed. Shortly after the trial concluded, while his appeal was still pending, Reinhold Hanning died in the town of Lager, located in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. He passed away on May 30, 2017, at the age of 95. His lawyer, Andreas Scharmer, confirmed the news, although he declined to provide further details about the circumstances. At the time of his death, the sentence had not yet become legally final, as the appeal before the Federal Court of Justice was still pending. This prevented him from serving the sentence imposed for complicity in the crimes committed at Auschwitz. The news generated critical reactions from the victims' community. Thomas Walter, the lawyer who represented more than 20 civil parties, lamented that the sentence had not been carried out. In his view, the case highlighted the long period of judicial inaction that allowed many responsible parties to evade consequences for decades. Irmgard Furchner, the secretary who typed the machinery of horror. The trial of Irmgard Furchner marked another attempt, albeit belated, to bring to justice those who operated from the administrative rearguard of the crime. Born in May 1925, she attended primary school during the 1930s. Upon completion, she participated in the Rural Year, a formative period promoted by the regime's youth organizations. She then pursued studies in business, which allowed her to work as a stenographer at a branch of the Dresdner Bank in Marienberg. After the bank closed, she was transferred to the city of Gdansk. There, at just 18 years old, she began working at the Stutthof concentration camp. Her duties consisted of typing documents and assisting with administrative tasks, reporting directly to Commandant Paul Werner Hoppe and his assistant. She carried out her work in a room adjacent to the main office, from where communications with the central SS apparatus were managed. With the end of the war, she left the camp without being arrested. In 1954, she was called to testify as a witness in a court case, and admitted that all correspondence between the camp and the SS economic headquarters passed through her hands. That same year, she married Heinz Furchner, an SS non-commissioned officer also stationed at Stutthof. They remained married until 1972. Later, she settled in a town in northern Germany, where she worked as an administrative clerk until her retirement. In 2017, she entered a nursing home. Although she had age-related hearing and vision problems, she did not suffer from any serious illnesses and used a walker. Meanwhile, the history of the place where she had worked began to be revisited in greater depth. Stutthof, located near the present-day Polish city of Gdansk, was one of the many sites of Nazi extermination. It is estimated that some 65,000 people were murdered there, including Jews, non-Jewish Polish civilians, and Soviet prisoners. Beginning in June 1944, gas chambers were used as part of the system for eliminating people. In this context, Furchner was accused of contributing to the murder of 10,505 people and the attempted murder of 5 others. Her role as the commandant's secretary was considered essential to the functioning of the camp's bureaucratic apparatus. The documents she processed were part of the operational chain that made repression, deportations, and systematic crimes possible. Since she was between 18 and 19 years old at the time of the events, the case was tried in a juvenile court in Itzehoe. From the outset of the proceedings, Furchner refused to participate. In a letter to the court, she expressed her intention not to appear, calling the trial humiliating. However, German law requires the defendant's physical presence. On September 30th, 2021, the day the trial was scheduled to begin, she discreetly left the nursing home where she lived. She took a taxi to a subway station in Norderstedt and failed to appear in court. She was located shortly afterward, arrested and remanded in custody. She remained in custody for 5 days before being released on bail. The hearing was rescheduled for October 19th. During the proceedings, testimony was presented from several camp survivors, some of whom died before the trial concluded. In the final hearings, Furchner broke her silence. She stated briefly that she regretted what had happened and her involvement at Stutthof. She claimed to have nothing more to say. On December 20th, 2022, the court handed down its verdict. It found her guilty and sentenced her to 2 years in prison, suspended. The decision provoked mixed reactions. Ephraim Zuroff of the Simon Wiesenthal Center noted that, while this was the maximum sentence allowed under the law, the punishment was merely symbolic given the magnitude of the crimes. The defense requested acquittal, arguing that the extent of the defendant's knowledge could not be determined with certainty. They maintained that Furchner was part of a larger group of typists working for Commander Hopper, and that individual responsibility could not be conclusively attributed to her. However, the court rejected this interpretation. Judge Dominic Gross found it proven that Furchner not only understood the nature of the system in which she worked, but also directly contributed to its operation. He noted that administrative actions are not exempt from criminal liability when carried out with knowledge of their criminal purpose. In its ruling, the court emphasized that it was inconceivable that someone in her position could not have perceived the smoke or smell of the executions, and noted that she could have disengaged at any time. During the trial, conclusive evidence was presented. Historian Stefan Herdler accompanied 2 judges on an inspection of the camp, where he demonstrated that Furchner had direct visibility over particularly sensitive areas. He also submitted archival documents, including a 1954 statement signed by Heinz Furchner, in which he affirmed that within the camp command circle, the gassing executions were openly discussed. He also pointed out that between June and October 1944, 27 transports arrived carrying approximately 48,000 people, coinciding with the camp's expansion and the systematic use of Zyklon B. In its final verdict, the court affirmed that the defendant, although she did not physically participate in the murders, played a technical and administrative role that facilitated their execution. The appeals court upheld this conclusion by dismissing the defense's appeal, thus confirming the conviction. Having committed the acts before the age of 20, her case was tried under juvenile criminal law. Pursuant to Article 105 of the Juvenile Justice Act, her personal and intellectual development was deemed comparable to that of a minor. Therefore, and in accordance with Article 2.3 of the Criminal Code, the more lenient law was applied. The court noted that, during the Third Reich, the law only recognized as young persons those under the age of 18. Had the adult criminal law in force at that time been applied, the consequences would have been substantially more severe. In the final sessions of the trial, several survivors offered powerful personal testimonies. Josef Salomonovich, whose father was murdered at Stutthof when he was just 6 years old, testified that, although Irmgard Furchner did not directly carry out the crimes, her administrative role was an integral part of the system that made them possible. Manfred Goldberg, also a survivor of the camp, expressed his disappointment with what he considered a symbolic sentence, insufficient given the magnitude of the crime. A little over 2 years later, in January 2025, Irmgard Furchner's death was officially confirmed. The Itzehoe Regional Court, where she had been tried, reported her passing, which marked the end of one of the last major trials related to the bureaucratic machinery of the Holocaust. Her case, beyond its specific criminal implications, came to represent a final chapter in German jurisprudence concerning the crimes committed by the Nazi regime. The trial garnered significant attention both in Germany and abroad. Beyond the 2-year suspended sentence she received, the public debate centered on the moral and legal significance of the proceedings. Organizations dedicated to historical memory and numerous survivors highlighted the institutional value of the verdict, emphasizing that, despite the passage of time and the apparent hierarchical subordination of the accused, accountability remained necessary. Furchner's death reinforced the perception that no one remained alive who could be brought to justice for their involvement in the extermination structure. This event reignited a complex debate surrounding delayed justice. While some questioned its practical effectiveness, others defended its ethical dimension and its restorative impact. In this sense, the Furchner case served as a persistent reminder that even those who held administrative positions, often perceived as secondary, had to answer to the law. It also demonstrated that the function of justice does not end with the passage of decades, especially when dealing with crimes whose gravity transcends time. John Demjanjuk, the trial that crossed 3 continents. With the death of Irmgard Furchner, many assumed that Holocaust-related trials had come to an end. However, the case of John Demjanjuk demonstrated that the pursuit of justice continued far beyond Germany's borders. His legal journey spanned 3 countries, several decades, and various legal systems. Demjanjuk arrived in the United States in 1952 under the Displaced Persons Act and became a citizen in 1958. He settled in Cleveland, Ohio. However, in the early 1980s, the federal government initiated proceedings to revoke his citizenship. The Northern District Court of Ohio concluded that he had entered the country deliberately concealing essential information about his wartime past. According to the investigation, he had been drafted into the Red Army in 1940, captured by German forces in 1942, and subsequently trained as a guard at the SS-run Tronicky Training Center. Later that same year, he allegedly began serving as an armed guard at the Treblinka extermination camp. During the trial, Demjanjuk admitted to lying about his whereabouts between 1937 and 1948 and about his involvement with units linked to the Nazi regime. He justified these omissions by claiming he feared deportation to the Soviet Union, where he feared reprisals for his connection to the German army. In light of this evidence, the court determined that he had fraudulently acquired Israeli citizenship. The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals upheld the sentence, finding sufficient evidence to prove his role as a guard trained by the SS. Simultaneously, the State of Israel requested his extradition. The U.S. federal court concluded that there were probable causes to authorize it in accordance with the existing bilateral treaty. His bail was revoked, and he was taken into custody by the Attorney General pending extradition. Demjanjuk then filed a writ of habeas corpus, arguing that his detention violated constitutional rights and international treaties. The Northern District Court of Ohio rejected the writ, a decision upheld by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. The judges determined that the charges related to the mass murders at Treblinka fell under the category of homicide, as defined by the extradition treaty between the 2 countries, and that Israeli jurisdiction was supported by the principle of universal jurisdiction. They further noted that extradition proceedings do not require conclusive proof of guilt, but rather the existence of reasonable suspicion. In support of the Israeli request, sworn statements were presented from witnesses who identified Demjanjuk in a 1952 photograph as Ivan the Terrible, a Treblinka guard implicated in the mass murders. They stated that they had seen him leading prisoners to the gas chambers and operating the execution system. An identification card belonging to Tronicky, bearing his name and photograph, was also presented. Although the defense maintained that the document was forged, the court considered that the testimonies alone justified the extradition. During this phase, the defense requested the recusal of Judge Frank Battisti, arguing that his involvement in the denationalization process compromised his impartiality. The request was denied due to a lack of evidence demonstrating bias. Once the extradition order was ratified, the final decision rested with the Secretary of State, in accordance with the executive branch's authority in foreign policy matters. Demjanjuk was ultimately extradited to Israel, where he was sentenced to death in April 1988. However, in 1992, new evidence emerged that called into question his identification as Ivan the Terrible. Documents from Soviet archives pointed to another individual, the Ukrainian Ivan Marchenko, as the true perpetrator of the crimes he was accused of. The defense alleged that the U.S. Department of Justice had omitted this information during the proceedings. Following these revelations, the U.S. Court of Appeals reopened the case and appointed federal Judge Thomas Wiseman as special investigator to determine whether there had been a deliberate concealment of evidence by the authorities. The request for his extradition was deemed premature, as the Israeli Supreme Court had not yet issued a final ruling. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice argued that, regardless of the Treblinka case, Demjanjuk's record at other camps, such as Sobibor, was sufficient to justify his permanent exclusion from the country. In July 1993, Judge Wiseman concluded that, while prosecutors had made investigative errors and failed to demonstrate sufficient skepticism, no deliberate intent to suppress exculpatory evidence had been proven. He confirmed that evidence placed Demjanjuk at Trauniki and that he had concealed key information upon entering the United States. Despite this, the report questioned the strength of his identification as Ivan the Terrible and underscored the fragility of the initial proceedings. Later that month, the Israeli Supreme Court overturned the conviction and death sentence, finding reasonable doubt about his identity as the notorious Treblinka guard. New testimonies from former camp staff members, discovered in Soviet archives, pointed to another individual whose whereabouts remained unknown. After decades of legal proceedings in the United States, the case of John Demjanjuk was revived in Europe. In 2005, an immigration judge ruled that he could be deported to Germany, Poland, or Ukraine. His defense argued that he would be at risk of torture in Ukraine, but an appeals court upheld the decision the following year, concluding that there was insufficient evidence to justify such a fear. In 2008, the US Supreme Court rejected his final attempt to halt the deportation. Shortly thereafter, German authorities issued an arrest warrant in March 2009. Weeks later, federal agents arrested him at his home in Cleveland. Although an appeals court initially blocked the deportation, the Ohio State Court ruled that the deportation should proceed, finding that adequate guarantees regarding his medical care at his destination were in place. At 90 years old, Demjanjuk was finally deported to Germany. There he faced a new trial, this time before a Munich court, accused of having collaborated in the murder of 27,900 people during his service as a guard at the Sobibor extermination camp. During the hearings, he appeared in a wheelchair and remained inactive for most of the time. The prosecution's case was not based on specific individual actions, but rather on his mere participation as part of the extermination apparatus. The sentence was handed down in May 2011, 5 years in prison for complicity in crimes committed at Sobibor. However, due to his health and advanced age, he was allowed to remain free while the appeal was being resolved. Both the defense and the prosecution appealed the ruling, the latter requesting a harsher sentence. Pending a final decision, the sentence was not yet final, and according to the legislation in force, his presumption of innocence had to be maintained. During that period, he was neither transferred nor summoned to court. His physical condition progressively deteriorated until his death on March 17, 2012, in a nursing home in Bavaria. Because the sentence was not upheld by the higher court, he died a free man, having never been legally convicted. Throughout these stories, one constant remains unsettling. Justice, in many cases, came too late, if it came at all. While the victims and their families bore the weight of the horror, many perpetrators continued their lives free, without any real consequences. The Belated trials, though symbolic, revealed a deeper truth, the resistance of institutions and societies to confront their past, because it is not just about individual guilt, but about an entire structure that allowed impunity. Remembering is not enough. Only a commitment to the truth can prevent it all from happening again.